pair of bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. This is an exciting episode, our first in our brand new debut spotlight series. Each episode in this series will be highlighting a debut author and putting their books firmly on your radar. Alongside deep diving into their debut novels, we will be getting all of the insights into their debut journey.
Today's episode is with Rosie Andrews and her debut novel, The Leviathan. Rosie was born in Liverpool and studied history at Cambridge before becoming an English teacher. Her debut, The Leviathan, has been perfectly described as a stunning literary historical mystery with a supernatural twist and is out in paperback now. Rosie, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, what we like to start with, and our bookends will know this by now, we like to ask our guests, what are you currently reading?
Well, I just finished one and started another. The one that I have just finished is actually out in April. So it's a novel that sadly for readers, they won't be able to get immediate hold of, but was just brilliant. It was called The North Shore by a debut writer called Ben Tufnell. And I'd never heard of Ben and I didn't know particularly much about his work, but it turns out that he is also Norfolk based, or was when he was young. And the novel is a kind of gothic coming of age tale, which links quite heavily into the Norfolk area where the Leviathan is set, and was just fabulous. I really, really loved his writing. And then it's just after that, I've moved on to another proof that somebody has sent me, because I love reading the proofs, which is called The Company. And that's a Victorian Gothic, which is about a sort of wallpaper company and an arsenic scandal in the 1870s. And the writer's name eludes me for a minute, but I'm enjoying it.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
I mean, that's surely a huge benefit of being an author, is that you get sent all these proofs.
Just incredible. People actually send me things and go, would you read this? And I'm like, yes.
Yes, please. Free books. Yes, I'm in.
Yeah. Whenever we get sent anything free, we're like, yeah, and we read it immediately.
We'll take it.
Never say no.
But I mean, those sound great, and pre-orders are really important, especially to debut authors. So listeners, get pre-ordering. Those sound great. And we will link those in the show notes as well. So we would love to start with asking you what the journey to writing and publishing your debut has been like. Could you tell us more about it?
So I'm not unique, but I might be unusual in terms of not having seen myself as a would-be author since I was young. A lot of people say I always wanted to be a writer, and that's not quite true of me. I had a big hiatus or a gap between I started university, I got a job, I left that job, I became an English teacher. And at that point, being an author or writing a novel hadn't occurred at all to me. And more as I was teaching, I found myself writing little bits, little segments to show my students, and many of them said, oh, that's good, miss. And I was like, well, don't go too wild. And a couple of them said, you should be a writer. And I was thinking to myself, you just want to get rid of me. And then so I started doing a couple of short stories, and I was very lucky to have one of them published and one of them shortlisted for a prize. And at that point, I thought to myself, well, I have a little girl now, and I'm at a point where I was part-time teaching, and I thought it's now or never if I want to have a go at writing the novel. I mean, it probably wasn't, but I thought that. And I had a chance to begin on a writer's course up in Cambridge, which was a sort of 12 incremental novel writing course to try to get you started. And that was wonderful. So I wrote one novel, and that wasn't the novel that eventually signed a book deal or an agent. I started another novel, and then that really went quite quickly. And quite shortly after that, I found my lovely agent, who's brilliant and very encouraging. And shortly after that, Bloomsbury, said yes, and that was very exciting. And I think at that point, that's when it becomes really surreal, when you realize somebody's actually going to publish something that you've written, which is quite a scary thought in many ways, because it stops being yours and starts being something that anyone can rightly comment on, like, dislike, hate with every fibre of their being if they want to. And so it becomes a bit terrifying. And then as the publication date creeps closer and closer, it's quite, it's an anxious time, I think. And many writers have described this to me, and I felt it too, of constantly looking at, your email to work out, did somebody really send me a contract? Have I made all this up? You tell friends and family I'm going to be published, and then there's a long space of time and they're thinking to themselves, yeah, okay, of course you're going to be published. And then all of a sudden, it's in the shops and people are talking to you about it, and that's all a big, or for me it was a very, again, a surreal time. And then after that it comes out, and a couple of months later, of course, a hardback publication. There was a huge amount of fuss, and that was brilliant. And then suddenly things are a bit quieter, and you think again, did I make it all up? And then you hit the publication paperback date. And at that point as well, I think most people are writing the second novel and trying to dovetail the writing with the publicity and so on. So it's all in all been incredible and surreal.
Wow. That sounds amazing. Obviously, with this being, a debut series, like it is amazing to hear about your journey into getting published. And one of my closest friends, she's as we were talking about before, but she's the kind of writer where she's been writing for her whole life. She's always wanted to do this, and she's had plays on. And that's how I know her, because I've been in her plays, and she's currently trying to get her debut published. And just watching like how it's a really like chaotic kind of journey, having this book sent out to people, and she feels like she's constantly checking her emails and constantly seeing if like, has anybody got back to me yet? Does anybody want this? And it's it's interesting to hear from you that it wasn't the first book that you wrote that was published, and you hear that quite often, don't you, that it's not somebody's first book that they write that's the one that gets published. And that seems, it's almost a shame in a sense, because it's like the amount of work, as I watch with my friend, the amount of work that goes into writing a book, and then for that not to get published. Like, do you have any advice, I guess, for writers that are, waiting to hear back from publishers, or that might not get their first one accepted, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's one of those things that's short-term disappointing or discouraging, and long-term encouraging, because as a writer, you're never going to reach a point, as I've learned, where people saying no goes away. That is something that professional writers experience, that people who've had 15 books out will still experience. And I think that remembering that the evolution of a writer it goes past publication. Publication is a thing that happens, hopefully, for many people, but your evolution as a writer goes long beyond that. So every scrap of writing that you've done, everything that you've got in a bottom drawer, helped to shape that. It was still, the learning experience that you need. And although publication is fantastic and a sort of cherry on the top of having written something, you still wrote it. You still have that book. It's still an achievement. And not forgetting, of course, that there are times and places where particular genres, particular forms of writing are more popular and less popular. You still have it. There's no reason in the future why somebody might not go, hold on, let's have a look at that you wrote back when you were 35, and maybe not thinking that it would be published. So I would say to take a long view is probably the most encouraging way of thinking about it.
I feel like I need like that in my head all of the time.
Yeah.
Like play the long game.
Play the long game.
Yeah, it is a long game.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So moving on to the book itself, the Leviathan, it's not to be defined by a single genre. It's both thrilling and fantastical, dramatic and historical. Did you have a genre in mind when developing and writing the book itself?
I would say that exactly what you just said. I love historical fiction. So if I were to say a historical fiction writer that I particularly admire, I love CJ Sansom, for example, who wrote the Dissolution series, which is straight historical fiction. There's nothing particularly magical happening. I love all of that. I also love fantasy writing. So if I were to suggest a fantasy writer that I lean into or enjoy, Tolkien is probably the most obvious example. I don't necessarily see myself as sitting within either of those two spaces, maybe quite naturally. So I can write historical fiction, and I do enjoy it. And my first published short story was set in the early 1950s. And I'm thinking of my next novel that I'm starting to think about might be in and around that time as well. So I like all sorts of historical fiction. I tend to lean towards something a bit odd happening, the magical, the slightly wild. And that's just the way my brain works. I think, what strange thing could come into play here that I could I could throw in, and you have to guard against making that so completely mental that nobody wants to touch it. And of course there are trends. So although as I've said, the gothic fiction genre I think has been enjoying such a massive resurgence at this time, there might be a time in the future where there isn't such an appetite for it. And the other thing that I particularly love, which is normal historical fiction, as it were, would come back into play for me. So yeah, I think you're right in what you said originally, that it's a bit fantastical, a bit historical. That's what I love doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you are either. We're not particularly huge historical fiction readers. And I think for me, having that fantastical element and having you know, elements of witchcraft and elements of, you know, mythology and things like that in it, that for me as a reader was something that was like, I can really get on board with this.
Yeah.
Like you know, because usually if someone says to me, oh, it's historical fiction, I'm like, oh, you know, it's going to be hard to read, or you know, I do have a lot of those kind of prejudices.
I'm exactly the same.
Yeah, and then the minute, like, I think on the blurb it mentions, you know, this kind of like, she is awake, and it's like, oh my god, what is that? You know, and immediately I'm like, well, I've got to read this. And I think that is such a wonderful mix of all of those different things. That's what I really loved about it.
I was really pleasantly surprised by how absorbed I was by your book. Like, because I'm exactly the same. I don't know why I've got this strange bias about historical fiction. It's not that I've ever read anything particularly bad. It's I don't know what it is. I can't describe it. I just have this weird thing about like where I'm like reluctant to pick them up, and then I just got completely absorbed by your book, and I was like, okay, maybe I've been wrong about this. I can get on board with this.
I mean, one thing I would say is that historical fiction leans towards the big, the dense. So, you know, sometimes I find myself picking up a book in historical fiction and thinking, maybe not. You know, I know I probably will enjoy it, but at the same time, I can see that it's 600 pages ahead of me.
Yeah.
And I tend to write a little lighter maybe than the traditional historical fiction author. I don't tend to run to 400, 700, 1,000 pages. And that's just a kind of natural, the way a story works in my mind. But there are certain novels, I mean, I love Hilary Mantel, for example, Wolf Hall, just brilliant. At the same time, you've got to put the time aside for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I still haven't read Wolf Hall,
No,
so
I've got it on my shelf. That's ready.
But
I feel like this is a good stepping stone.
It's a good stepping stone.
Like, if you're a bit scared, if you're a bit kind of like, oh, I don't know whether it's for me, I honestly can't recommend this book enough for you to just have a go and just see, because honestly, I think you'd be really pleasantly surprised. I do.
Yeah, definitely. So I did mention it briefly before, but I did in an interview that you did that you started writing. It was only a couple of years ago that you came back to writing. Was it the Leviathan that made you want to go into writing again, or like how did that happen? Like what inspired the Leviathan, the novel?
So no, the first part of the question, no, I was writing before the idea for the Leviathan came. However, in terms of where those ideas came from, they're actually, many of them date back to when I was studying at university, and I was studying, which is many years ago now, but the Tudor and Stuart periods, Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, which is a sort of political, philosophical work. And a lot of the elements, if you like, that have gone into making the story are things that have lived with me for a very long time. So I enjoy things like anything to do with the sea. For example, I'm on board. Anything that is to do with mythological creatures. So if you give me a dragon, or you give me a, you know, some sort of thing that may or may not exist, love it. So those sorts of elements have all been present for me for a great, you know, a long period. And when I started writing, I had this sort of fear of whether I was throwing everything but the kitchen sink in here, if that makes sense. And it went all down, and I thought, look at all these inspirations. And met another of them, I suppose, was Paradise Lost and John Milton, who comes into the story in a way maybe that a person might not expect, knowing his work, but in a way that I hope works. And so there was excuse me, I've got my pen, a long list of inspirations that I had to kind of corral together and try to make into something coherent, which I hope it succeeds in doing. But yeah, I was fearful for a while that it was just too much, you know, too much of a melting pot. But then that's the kind of fiction that I like. So.
It definitely, to me, it didn't feel like that at all. It felt very much like it had, I don't know, like it was ticking all the boxes that I love in a book, you know, and it felt very cohesive, and it felt like each part was valuable to the story. It wasn't just there for any reason. It wasn't there to be fantastical or just we'll chuck a monster in or we'll chuck a bit of witchcraft in. It felt very much like suitable for the world, and you know, it felt like it was natural for it to be there.
I think a lot of that comes down to the 17th century's politics, its belief landscape, it's sort of the way that people conceptualized the world and the way that they imagined things to be, I say imagined, believed things to be true, to do with witches, to do with, as you say, monsters. And it's so different to the way that many people think now. I think one of the nicest things for me about writing in that period is to place myself, or try to place myself, in their mindset and think, well, what's possible now? Because of course magic and monsters and mythology, those things loom so large for them that I hope you can feel as you read the novel that they really thought that they might be possible and true, which is just a great space for me to write in, because you can basically do anything, make it as weird as you like.
I love that. And talking about like the themes of the book, morality plays such a key role throughout the narrative, particularly the juxtaposition of good versus evil, and you know, God versus the devil. Was morality something you wanted to focus on with the book?
Absolutely. So the period of history that the book is set in, the earlier period, the 1643 period, the religious clash, the clash between people who were very radically Protestant or Puritan and people who were perhaps more moderate or lean towards even a crypto-Catholicism that was still present in the country. They were everybody who I have come across in my research were very preoccupied with this idea of morality, of goodness, of what would secure your position in heaven, what would secure your position in God's sight as a good person. So these were central questions for them. And I think, you know, that part of any book, for me, any good book, is conflict, and the idea that an internal conflict for a character might rage about what's the best thing to do. That's one of the things that makes a good story, isn't it? So I think that that was a really good confluence of things where I could bring together what they felt and thought with the thing that we would hope would go into any good story about choices that people have to make.
Yeah, and I think it's very clear, isn't it, the influence that the time period has on those decisions that they're making in terms of, especially with Esther, and initially her virtue, and she's seen as very kind of to be protected because she's such a good person, you know, and as the story progresses, without giving too much away, a lot of that changes, a lot of people's opinions of her change. And I think it's so interesting to see, particularly with her character, how that issue of morality changes.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think one of the things that's pertinent there is the idea of female agency. So we were, when we read a novel now, whether it's set in the 17th century or whether there were no novels, but a text that was written at that time or earlier, a play or something like that, we look at the characters very differently, and we think about paternalism, and we think about feminism, and we think about, isn't it a bit odd that a woman or a girl of 16 or 17 might be thinking about marriage? Some people do, but it's unusual, but also might not have the level of personal agency that a woman now would expect to have. And I think that evolution of Esther's character is important, isn't it? Because she moves into a position of power, away from a position of power, which one is it? But certainly moves away from what you expect of her when you meet her at the beginning of the story. So I wanted to present a character initially very much under the conventions of her time, and then see, you know, where that took me. Whether people like it or not is that's the question.
Well,
I loved it.
I'm gonna do your heading. I'm gonna skip ahead because something you just said about like female agency and about, you know, I just need to ask this question. So I'm always interested in looking at historical works, you know, whether it be TV, film, books, anything like that, to see how women are portrayed and, you know, how those things reflect the treatment of women throughout history. It's just something that I'm really interested in. And, you know, at the start of the novel, Esther is described at one point as hysterical. I don't know why, but I just wrote down that she was described as hysterical, and I knew that would, I had to write that down at the time, and I'm glad I did. But and I can't say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. And towards the midsection onwards, there is a character that is treated almost like a dangerous wild animal, that is a woman. And there's also, you know, the fear of people being perceived as witches. You know, there's all those kinds of things that I'm really interested in. So with these, obviously the book is very well researched and you can see that when you read it, but was this something that you came across a lot in your research, you know, about, I'm really interested to hear about, you know, what you came across.
I think it's omnipresent, isn't it, in literature, in historical writing, in whether it's political writing of that time or not, the idea that there is such a thing as an archetypal good woman and an archetypal bad woman, that a woman is someone who needs to be managed. A woman is somebody who needs to be controlled in a particular way in order to meet a set of external standards that are imposed upon her. And the interesting thing for me was that my main character, Thomas, is a man, and he's trying to be a good man, but at the same time, he's not somebody who can very easily step outside those strictures, and nor would it be realistic if he did. You know, if I had presented a sort of modern man, I don't think that would work with this story at all. So he had to be somebody who, I mean, some people have described him as patriarchal. Yes, he is. Some people have described him as a bit of a misogynist. Yes, he is. You know, that's exactly what he's like. He looks upon his younger sister as somebody who needs to be cared for, protected, not necessarily somebody who needs to make her own decisions. He looks upon her as good. He looks upon Chris and Moore as bad. These are viewpoints and assumptions that were so central to their existence as a society that I couldn't take them out, and nor would particularly I want to. So in the research, I think in everything I've read, everything I've looked at that time, particularly the religious research into what was expected of a Puritan woman, a woman living in a Puritan society, she was expected to be the Esther that we see at the start of the story. So meek, obedient, subservient, and certainly not a character with a power or agency of her own.
I find that fascinating, and particularly I love the way that religion and faith, we've touched upon this, but were very key components of the novel and the narrative, and particularly Thomas's character. We see many of the characters kind of struggle, embrace, or denounce their own faith throughout the narrative. What role did faith play for you when writing it?
Do you mean for me as a writer?
For you as a writer and for the characters.
I think that there's a sort of dualism in play there, which is to try to present their thoughts rather than mine. So from a historical perspective, everybody in that time period, virtually everybody, was religious. So the idea that we have very commonly now of an atheist, what's an atheist? Yeah. So what I was presenting at that time was a man whose belief that God might not exist would be considered so blasphemous that it would put him completely outside the confines of acceptable society. It might even be illegal. It might be something that led to consequences that were actually legal for him. So he would be punished for not believing. And then the other aspect of that is, as a modern writer, as a person who lives in a society where atheism is far more common, and not only common, but not questioned, not something that you would lead a person to be punished for, because that would be ridiculous. You know, it's also the novel is sort of commenting on my own liberalism, my sense that people should be able to believe whatever they want. And that's partly from I suppose that's a modern perspective that's quite common, but at the same time there are many people living in the world who still aren't allowed to believe whatever they like when it comes to religion. So they're the sort of the two components that I was thinking about, the historical and then my own, if you like, my author's perspective. I'm not sure how heavily that comes through.
I find that so interesting because I forget that it wasn't a thing back then to be an atheist and to kind of choose whether you wanted a religion at all. Like I just don't even think about things like you don't, do you? So yeah, that's just madness to me. But
it was very interesting the way that they spoke to each other.
Yeah.
In terms of like if they were even edging towards something that might be possibly blasphemous or possibly hinting at maybe not quite believing something, and it was all very shut down very quickly, like, but what do you think God would think? Like, careful now. And it felt very like he was, but particularly with Thomas, he was always sort of on the edge of things, sort of kind of like being very careful about what he was saying, how he was forming his words, because I think, because he did initially has that kind of almost lack of faith within himself, and very conscious of those around him, isn't he, about how he's coming across with that.
They were living, I think, in a heavily prescriptive place where you were not allowed to question normal orthodoxies. You were not allowed to say, not only do I not believe in God, for example, but you would not be allowed to say you didn't think that God was, Jesus was the Son of God. You would not be allowed to say you didn't believe in hell. You would not be allowed to say you didn't believe in virtually any part of the Orthodox Puritan faith, its belief system. So I think you're absolutely right. He has to watch every word and weigh it very carefully.
Yeah. So we've obviously touched on Thomas and Esther, but one thing that I am very interested about you is that you are the third of 12 children. Is that right?
That's right.
Oh, wow. Which is incredible. What did you want to communicate about family in your novel, but specifically the dynamics between siblings?
Absolutely. So as a person who grew up in a large family with lots of small siblings, that sense of responsibility for them, that sense of knowing that there are dangers that you might have to help them and protect them against and so on, particularly when you're quite young yourself and, like Thomas, not quite ready to step into a more paternal role, or maternal it would be in my case, but then the sense of the unconditional love that he offers to his sister in the end, wherever that leads them, I think is a really important part of what I was trying to convey. And quite interestingly, my second novel that I'm working on also brought out that sense of, always bringing out that sense of sibling relationships. What's very tricky for me, obviously, is having lived in such a big family, I find it much harder to conceptualize what it would be like to live in a tiny family. So he has one sister, he is solely responsible for her. And then obviously having lost their parents as well, that's very different. But I think that sibling relationships have been important to a couple of things that I've written, and I can't imagine that that's too separate from my experiences growing up.
No, definitely not. And I love reading about relationships between siblings. I mean, I'm one of 4 girls, so it's like I think this, don't need to say anything else.
That's it.
But the sibling relationship I find is so like powerful, and it does almost feel like at times that I especially feel it because I'm the oldest of 4, like I'm almost a third parent, I guess. And I always kind of took on that role, and I definitely see that in your novel between those 2 characters. You get a sense of the fact that one of them is trying to parent the other, whether the other one wants it or not.
Indeed.
My age gap with my brother is 17 years. He's 17 years older than me. So I felt very much, I'm very much the Esther of the relationship. And I was very much like on Esther's side, he's annoying.
He is annoying. I agree.
Like doing this annoying brotherly thing. So I was like, I feel you. I
mean, after people have read this book, I don't think you want to be broadcasting the fact that you are the...
No, maybe not. I'm the Esther at the beginning. Let's just say that. So moving on. So death and particularly grief. Everyone, all the bookends listening know that I love grief. Honestly, I want that on a t-shirt. I love grief. I love literary grief. They feature prominently throughout the book. We see losses occur particularly to Thomas, of close family and those around him. The frequency of this may be indicative to the time period. We know that it wasn't uncommon to see death around. But what I wanted to know really was how intentional was the inclusion of death and grief around Thomas.
The familiarity with Bible stories and the importance of that, the centrality of that to the narrative, I think it is important. And one of the stories that was important to me when I was formulating the Leviathan was the story of Job. So Job was a man in the Bible who was tested by God, and he was tested with his faith. Could God, I think it was a bet with the devil, could he maintain his faith in the face of a series of losses and tragedies that occurred to him, happened to him. So one of the things that happens to Thomas is, or several of the things that happen to him are difficult, are traumatic. And of course you would expect to see that in many novels of this type, but that sense of testing him in the face of loss was something that was important when I was writing it, and is also important in the Bible too. The appearance of the Leviathan, which is also something that happens in the story of Job. So there was that sort of elusive element to it. And then I think just generally when you have a main character who's a little bit cocky, a little bit, maybe he's just too sure of himself at the beginning, isn't he? He's a little bit overconfident. Again, testing him and seeing what you can do to change him is a useful experiment for a writer. You know, what can I do to this character? What will that do to them? I think so. It's something that I enjoy, doing horrible things to my character.
I love that. And it won't come as any surprise to anybody that my favourite Bible story is the story of Job.
Why does that not surprise me?
He just loses everything. He loses everything, and he comes out on top.
You're just drawn to the darkness.
I am drawn to the dark side.
He has a really bad day.
He has a really horrible time. Like literally, it's like you think it can't get any worse. It can,
It does.
and it does. Poor Job.
So you've touched on it a couple of times, but both the title and the story involve a Leviathan, which I know very little about a Leviathan other than that it's a mythological sea creature and it's giant, and that's kind of all I know about it. And I did have to Google what a Leviathan was when I read this book because I'd never heard of it before. So I am interested in, you know, what was the significance of this creature within your novel?
So the concept of and I'm obviously going to be giving a little more away in order to answer this question than maybe I normally do, but that's fine. The concept of the sea monster, the sort of world encircling serpent, is ubiquitous across different faiths, different cultures. It's something that you would see if you looked at the ancient Egyptians. It's something that you will see if you look at the Mesopotamians. It's something you see in Christian eschatological or sort of end of the world thought. And it's fascinating to me as to why that is. It's this idea as well that you see in Norse mythology of something that grows and grows from the beginning to the end of time. And its significance in the story, and I think also in those mythologies, is of contained chaos. So it's the idea that there are forces in the universe, both good and bad, both chaotic and orderly, that can only ever be temporarily restrained. And so there's always that potential, if you like, for them to spill over and become more powerful. And there's also almost an inevitability that they will. And I found that very interesting, both to see how that myth tracks through different cultures and different ideas, but also to then write about it. And I also mentioned at the beginning the Thomas Hobbes Leviathan, the political work, which is allegorical. Again, it's this idea that he raises up the state the political state as a kind of metaphorical Leviathan. That's what he calls it. He calls it this great monster that has almost unlimited power, but at the same time we need it in order to maintain the order that he thinks is central to not living in a state essentially of horrible chaos where we all murder everyone. So I thought that was also quite compelling in terms of Thomas's own decision making, and in the end the way that he has to make a decision that he doesn't want to make, but that has to be made for the benefit of everybody else. So that was the sort of connecting tissue behind the idea of the Leviathan in the story. Hopefully I haven't given too much away.
No, I think
you did really well.
You skirted around that very well. I would have done that. No, that's so interesting because yeah, like I said, I knew very little about it, and it kind of pieces stuff together that maybe I missed. I think if I went back and reread it, I'd probably I'd maybe look at things a little bit differently.
Like, I also like a book that can be read on different levels. I like a book that can be read just as a plain old adventure story, or something that you can, if you want, go and pick through and look at the things that link to other things and maybe enjoy it a second time with a bit more appreciation of them. But you know, the sorts of stories that I enjoy can usually be read on a more obvious level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it does really work as an adventure story, as this kind of like, it has, like I said at the beginning, it's got all these elements to it. It's just absolutely fabulous. I really loved the journey that you go on with it. And it's constantly surprising. That's what I like. Yeah. I think if you'd have asked me before I read it, what do you think it's going to be like? I'd have been way off. Yeah.
Yeah, there was some twists in there, shall we say? Yeah.
More than a few, let me tell you. And you won't be able to predict them. I've got a quote.
There she is.
I've got a quote. She's always got a quote. If I read a little quote to you. It's not really.
Do you mind her reading your own book back to you?
I feel like everybody hates this section, but I can't not read a quote, like if I've turned the corner, if it's important. I just wanted to give the readers, it's very early on in the book, it gives nothing away, don't worry guys, but I wanted to give everyone a bit of a taste about how well you do at building tension. I think that in terms of like the thrilling aspect of the book, the way that you use tension is just absolutely fantastic. So I'm just going to read a little bit. It's so good. So basically, give you a bit of context, Thomas is on his way home after a long time away. There was something wrong with the picture in front of me. I surveyed the fields on the southwest side of our farm. Other parts of father's land were tenanted, but these fields contain the animals we raised ourselves. I scanned the landscape, taking in the russet palette of the near frozen ground beset with the long shadow of trees, barely touched by a sun that had risen sulkily in the 2 hours since I had left Soto, and which would rise no further today. I held Ben's bridle as I looked through a gap in the hedge out across the open field. My eyes saw the problem before my mind caught up. It was late December. Father liked to put the ram to the ewes early. These ought to have been a mating dance in play, running, bleating, mounting, a ritual at once crude and sacred as old as time. I half expected to see Father cresting the low hill between the farmhouse and the road with his drooling mastiff, and a hey-ho for his son. Nothing moved. An uncertain breeze stirred my cloak, and from somewhere nearby an owl emitted a soft hoot. It was late for the bird to be abroad. What was that I could see? The light was thin and reedy. I strained my eyes to make out something lying on the ground, several hundred yards off, something lumpen and white, and beside it, another. And as my eyes refocused, another. On and on like a congregation of fallen angels. I watched, held between fascination and horror, as from a tree behind me, the owl swooped on its pale prey, holding down the unmoving flesh with its strong talons, tearing at the woolly hide with its cruel curved beak. I am become a brother of jackals, companion of owls. Honestly, then that is so early on in the book, and you just get this fantastic sense of foreboding.
It's that first line, there was something wrong with the picture in front of me. Yeah. Like, what's wrong with the picture in front of you? Tell me.
No. You have the lightest of touches with it. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel too much. It just feels like his natural reaction to what's around him. But there is this horrible, and it kind of continues throughout the novel, of something really bad is going to happen. And you don't know what it is. And every time something bad happens, you think, yeah, but there's going to be something worse. There feels like there's going to be something else. You don't feel that sense of relief.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know a bit more really about your process of building tension and maintaining tension throughout the narrative.
It's a challenge, isn't it? Because there are elements to writing within Gothic fiction, within tense fiction of all sorts, psychological fiction and so on, suspense, that you almost have to work out before you start, because you need to work out what you're aiming to do to the reader before you can do it. What is it that makes somebody feel that sense of foreboding? What is it that makes somebody feel that something really bad is coming and that it's going to keep coming without showing it to them? Because that's the whole point, isn't it? You have to keep something from them in order to create that fear. When I read, I'm very rarely afraid when I read stories, even though I love them. So I like gritty, I like horror, I like frightening, I like ghostly, but I'm very rarely frightened. One story that did scare me was, I think it's M.R. James, and it's Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. Have you read it? Yeah.
Oh, it's terrifying.
Isn't it terrifying? So
it's horrible.
And I was like, why is this so horrible? And the answer for me is, I think, uncertainty. That the thing that creates fear is the imagination process that's going on as the slow reveal of facts assails the reader, if that makes sense. So you don't want to give them too much. You want to make sure that there's something coming. You want to hint at it. It needs to be nebulous. It needs to be something that they can start to shape in their mind. And in their mind, it should be more terrifying than it is in suggestion, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's always in outline that you successfully terrify somebody, I think. So I love anything like that, anything Gothic. I've enjoyed Edgar Allan Poe for the same reason. So books that are maybe more 19th century, where the Gothic is a little bit more common, but then taking that back into the 17th, where there aren't as many novels lying around.
Amazing. Well, you did a very good job of scaring me off to death.
Yeah, the tension was there. I was gripped.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, I need to know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I felt really on edge.
And reading it together was hard because we were both like, we've got to this bit yet.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like, oh no. Wait, get worse, get worse.
So I would love to carry on talking about the Leviathan, but I would be concerned about giving too much away, and I want readers to enjoy it for themselves. So there is a link in the show notes to order yourself the book. If you haven't read it already, please go and buy it because it's brilliant. Rosie, what's next for you? Are we going to see more?
Yes. So there is at the end of the paperback, although you probably won't be able to see it because I'm talking on a podcast, but there is a reference to a second book coming, which is a Gothic story set in the 19th century, so linking to what we were talking about, called The Puzzlewood. So I'm hoping to see that in 2024.
Amazing.
Well, we will be automatic buyers of that.
Yes,
and
100%.
we unfortunately, we do expect you to come back on.
Please do.
Absolutely.
So, as this is a series to highlight debut authors, are there any debut authors you'd like to put on the radar of our listeners? Any other debut authors?
I've read quite a few recently. There's a novel that I really, really love by a lady called Annie Kirby, which is called The Hollow Sea, which is I thought was brilliant for it was out last year, but is a debut. Brilliant for people who like mythology, who like it's a more modern story. It's not a historical novel, but mythology and suspense and mystery. That was absolutely amazing. I've also recently finished a book that's coming, or two books actually that are coming this year. One is Weyward by Emilia Ward.
Oh yeah, I've just got the proof for that.
Fantastic, this beautiful fluorescent pink cover, but then inside so much in the way of witchcraft, female power. It's just brilliant. And then something that's perhaps more along the lines of a Turn of the Screw or a Vanity Fair, elusive to both of those, is a book that's coming this year called Fyneshade, which is a Gothic mystery by a lady called Kate Griffin, who I believe writes under a different name for young adult audiences, which I can't remember, but that was fantastic as well.
Awesome, fantastic recommendations there.
Perfect recommendation.
And I feel like Weyward's just gone up your two
Yeah,
pile.
literally, I just thought it was funny, like I got Weyward and we were like, oh, that sounds good, but now that you've told me it's about that, I'm like, okay.
No.
I'm going to be reading that pretty soon.
Amazing.
So I think all we've got left to say really is, we do like to do this, we do like to ask people before we let them go. Have you got any cultural recommendations for us? It can be any music you've listened to, plays you've seen, TV you've watched over Christmas.
TV. I've been watching more TV than I'm supposed to, but I've been recently, this is something that everybody's started watching again, isn't it? I've been watching Happy Valley recently.
Oh, yeah.
Which it's one of those things that I start thinking, oh, I'm not going to enjoy this that much. And then all of a sudden I'm just in and completely hooked. So I've started that. The other thing that I really enjoyed over Christmas was a BBC World Service radio programme of Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising, which is a series of 5 books that were written for children, which centre on the idea of a massive conflict between the dark and the light, and a young boy who becomes central to that conflict. And that is a 12-parter, which is all available, I think, on BBC World Service Radio. Just brilliant.
It's an exciting recommendation.
Oh, that's it. I've got a list of one of my arms now.
Yeah, you have given us a good few recommendations throughout the podcast, so thank you. Is there any way that our listeners can find you, not in person? That would be strange. Can they find you on social media and maybe follow you to see what you're up to?
Yes, I am present on social media. I have a Twitter account under Rosie Andrews, and I think it's at Rosie Andrews 22. And that's my only social media. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Rosie. This has been brilliant. And we've loved chatting to you, and we loved reading your book. And listeners, I hope that if you haven't already read it, like I said before, go get it ordered. Go give Rosie a follow, so you can see all the exciting work that is yet to come from her. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do rate, review and subscribe, as it helps to boost us in the charts. You can also give us a follow at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much again, Rosie, and I can't wait to see what else you write.
Thank you, it was my pleasure.
Thank you so much.